Will Bacchus of CBS Sports wrote a column over the weekend detailing the 15 worst coaching hires of the past decade. Tennessee football head coach Jeremy Pruitt came in at number 5. Bacchus wrote, quote, Pruitt, who coached under the likes of Jimbo Fisher, Mark Richt, and Nick Saban, was one of the best defensive coordinators of the past decade. It seemed like a matter of time before he earned a power conference job. Tennessee made that a reality in 2018, tabbing him as the team's leader after a bungled coaching search. That in itself is a story for another time. His real legacy lies in the NCAA investigation into recruiting violations that led to his firing for cause following a 3-7 2020 campaign. The NCAA Committee on Infractions found the Pruitt's program responsible for more than 200 individual violations, including 18 level 1 in nature. All of his wins from 2019 to 2020 were vacated, and Tennessee was hit with a scholarship reduction that hindered new coach Josh Heupel until recently, plus an $8 million fine. Pruitt will likely never coach college football again. Given what he left Heupel, it's a miracle that Heupel's won 37 games in 4 years. Jeremy Pruitt as a hire was obviously a disastrous hire. What makes the hire worse is not just the bungled coaching search, which was bad. And for those who don't remember, Tennessee went from before the leak happened, we know now from leaked emails that Tennessee initially reached out to John Gruden and he wasn't interested. Then they went the Dan Mullen route. He wasn't interested. And I do believe they did go the Chip Kelly route, but he wasn't interested. Partially because they waited so long to fire Butch Jones. Then they went for Greg Schiano, and they tried to make the Greg Schiano hire, and that was the official hire they were going to make, and they tried to sell it to everybody the day after the last game of the year when they finished 4-8, 0-8 in SEC play for the first time in history. Fans revolted. They didn't want the Greg Schiano hire. It fell apart, and it didn't work. After that, Tennessee went to Mike Gundy, who turned him down. Then they went to Jeff Brom. They seemed to have the Jeff Brom hire in hand, but an offer was made without the president's approval, so that offer was rescinded. By that point, Jeff Brom rejected the Tennessee offer. Then they went to Dave Doran at NC State, who rejected the offer. And then in a last-minute Hail Mary, they tried to get Mike Leach, but as John Curry was trying to get Mike Leach behind the backs of the chancellor and the administration, Philip Fulmer orchestrated a coup to get John Curry fired, make himself athletic director, and then he went and made the hire of Jeremy Pruitt. Here's why Jeremy Pruitt on its face was a horrible hire. In many ways, it was a self-serving move by Philip Fulmer. Fulmer orchestrated the coup and sabotaged what could have been a successful hire in Mike Leach, rest in peace, to then go make the hire himself and make himself athletic director. And then he picked a guy whose stardom would never outshine his own. Because there was no way you could pick Jeremy Pruitt at that time, a defensive coordinator, and believe and not get all the credit for the success Jeremy Pruitt has. Now, one of the reasons Pruitt seemed like a hot candidate at the time was he was a great defensive coordinator, and Kirby Smart was in the midst of getting to the national championship game his second year at Georgia. Smart, a Nick Saban defensive coordinator. Pruitt replaced him, a Nick Saban defensive coordinator. Pruitt also had coached the national championship multiple ones. He was in the midst of winning one at Alabama, and he had coached Florida State to win under Jimbo Fisher. So it just seemed like a repeat of a Georgia hire, but not every hire is the same. Not every hire works out. But it was more self-serving by Philip Fulmer than anything. And that was the biggest problem with the Jeremy Pruitt hire from the start. Now, let's play a little hot or cold. Hot or cold, brought to you by City Heating and Air, 50 years in East Tennessee, integrity matters, cityheatingair.com. We're going to go through all the hires on this ranking and ask which ones were worse on its face than the Jeremy Pruitt hire. Not which ones ended up being worse in hindsight. Which ones were worse on its face? Okay. Number 1, Chad Morris, Arkansas. Chad Morris at Arkansas. Well, actually, we'll start behind Jeremy Pruitt because I'll say if some of these were worse on their face and see how bad of hires they were. Number 15 is Chris Ash at Rutgers. Chris Ash at Rutgers was not a bad hire for the Scarlet Knights at the time. He had had success at Ohio State, winning a national title under Urban Meyer, And so there was a belief that he brought a championship pedigree. Rutgers was limited on what they could do. It didn't work out, but you can't blame them for that. They went after who they could go after at the time. Next was Nick Rolovich, Washington State. Okay, again, not as bad as Jeremy Pruitt on its face. There was no reason to believe Nick Rolovich wouldn't work out. There was the whole vaccine issue. I really don't want to get into that at all. But it obviously resulted in him not being able to keep his job. So that's a totally different story. On its face, Nick Rolovich, though, seemed like a solid hire at the time. He had been the head coach at Hawaii for 4 years and went 10-5 the last year before getting hired at Washington. So no, not worse than Jeremy Pruitt on its face. Number 13, Scott Frost at Nebraska. Scott Frost didn't work out. He should not be on this list. There was no reason to believe Scott Frost wouldn't work out at Nebraska. He had gone undefeated in his second year at UCF, inheriting a team that had lost every game 2 years before. Scott Frost, excuse me. There was no reason to not believe Scott Frost would work out. He shouldn't even be on here because you should consider how bad the hire was on its face and whether or not it should have been done. Number 12, Kevin Sumlin, Arizona, 9-20. Not a worse hire than the Jeremy Pruitt hire. Kevin Sumlin did get fired by Texas A&M, but he did have a winning record there every single year. It's just he couldn't get them to the next level. But for a school like Arizona, it did seem like the perfect place. So you can't really blame him. He did struggle, go 9-20, so ended up not working out. But not as bad on its face. Mel Tucker is very similar to the Jeremy Pruitt hire, funny enough. Mel Tucker at Michigan State in 2020. He's number 11 on this list. Mel Tucker actually worked out better than people thought at first. And then, of course, there was the whole personal issue that got him fired. But Mel Tucker had gotten Alabama to a national title game. I would say the hire on its face, though, was worse than the Jeremy Pruitt hire for Michigan State. Michigan State was a more successful program than Tennessee to that point when the hires were made. And Mel Tucker didn't have the same qualifications that Jeremy Pruitt had, believe it or not. And also, his resume was a 5-7 record at Colorado in 1 year before he went to Michigan State. So, yeah, I would actually say Mel Tucker was a worse hire than Jeremy Pruitt. On its face, was not a good hire. Brian Harsin, Auburn, not as bad as the hire as Jeremy Pruitt. Brian Harsin was a good hire coming from Boise State. He did have some success, even though he didn't have the backing of the boosters. I know it didn't work out, but that is what it is. Herm Edwards, Arizona State. Yeah, bad hire. They hired Herm Edwards worse than Jeremy Pruitt, largely because of the way they hired him. I think he could have worked out, but they hired him and then didn't let him pick his staff. So that whole thing was a disaster at Arizona State from the start. Not fully his fault, but that's why the thing went south so badly. Jimmy Lake at Washington. He was hired right before Kalen DeBoer got there. The hire didn't work out, but I mean, he was the defensive coordinator for Chris Peterson. He was the coach in waiting, the guy that seemed destined to take over for Chris Peterson. It wasn't a bad move, so it wasn't a worse hire than Jeremy Pruitt at Tennessee. Chris Peterson had great success at Washington, retired. Jimmy Lake seemed like the obvious choice to replace him. Mike Riley at Nebraska. Now, Mike Riley had a lot of success as a head coach before he was hired at Nebraska. But I'm still going to say that hire was worse than Jeremy Pruitt. Mike Riley was not having success at Nebraska towards the end before Nebraska hired him. From 2011 to 2014, Mike Riley went 3-9, 9-4, 7-6, 5-7. Nebraska hired him to replace Bo Pelini for not doing well enough when Bo Pelini had never won fewer than 9 games at Nebraska. It was a total mistake. That hire was bad on its face, despite Mike Riley's coaching experience at the time. Okay, he had done nothing but been mediocre at Oregon State. I don't know why they thought he would take Nebraska to the next level. He had 1 winning season at Nebraska, ironically lost to Tennessee. So I'm cold on Mike Riley I'm cold on Mike Riley. By the way, I guess the way I should say this is, am I hot on it being a worse hire than Jeremy Pruitt? So I'm hot on Mike Riley being a worse hire than Jeremy Pruitt. All right, here's a good one. Jeff Collins of Georgia Tech, number 6. Jeff Collins. Am I hot or cold on Jeff Collins being a worse hire than Jeremy Pruitt was on its face? And the answer to that is no. He had gone 7-6 and 8-4 at Temple. It's really hard to go 7-6 and 8-4 at Temple. And he had experience as Florida's defensive coordinator. Nope, I think Georgia Tech, not as bad of a hire as Jeremy Pruitt. Not a great hire, but not as bad of a hire as Jeremy Pruitt. I'm naming Jeremy Pruitt here. Now, number 4, Willie Taggart, Florida State. Not a worse hire on its face than Jeremy Pruitt. Not by a long shot. Willie Taggart had gone 10-2 at South Florida. He went 7-5 1 year at Oregon, but it did seem like he was going to build up Oregon after that because Mark Helfrich the program had fallen apart. So no, I'm cold on that. Willie Taggart, not a worse hire than Jeremy Pruitt, even though he didn't work out at Florida State. Ryan Walters, Purdue, who actually just recently got fired. Ryan Walters at Purdue was number 3 on this list. Was he a worse hire than Jeremy Pruitt on its face? Yes, I think he was a worse hire than Jeremy Pruitt on his face. He was Illinois' defensive coordinator and Missouri's defensive coordinator under Barry Odom and had not had hardly any success. I didn't think this was a good hire. It's not the type of hire Purdue needed to make when moving on from Jeff Brom, and it was a failure on its face, and it should have been seen as a failure on its face. Les Miles at Kansas. Worse hire than Jeremy Pruitt on its face? Yes, I know that sounds crazy, but the baggage with Les Miles was already out there when Les Miles got hired at Kansas from his time at LSU. And Les Miles, anybody who covered his tenure at LSU knew he was a bad coach who was a caretaker of a program that could wake up and get top 5 recruiting classes. Les Miles was not a smart guy. He was a bad hire for Kansas. Yes, on its face, and given his age, he was worse of a hire for Kansas and Jeremy Pruitt was for Tennessee. And number 1, Chad Morris for Arkansas. Absolutely on its face, a worse hire. Did not have the credentials as a coordinator that Jeremy Pruitt had. Now, Chad Morris had been a head coach, but as a head coach in 3 years at SMU, he went 2-10, 5-7, and 7-5. So his selling point was his experience as an offensive coordinator. But Clemson got better after he left as an offensive coordinator when they promoted Tony Elliott to the position. So yes, Chad Morris was worse on its face than Jeremy Pruitt. So with this list, who are the coaches that were worse hires on their face than Jeremy Pruitt? Chad Morris, Les Miles, Ryan Walters, Mike Riley. That's 4. Herm Edwards, 5. Mel Tucker, 6. And that's it. Those 6. So Jeremy Pruitt should actually be number 7 on this list. Not as bad as he's listed as a hire on this list, believe it or not. What about how he compares to other Tennessee hires on their face in the post-Philip Fulmer era? Excuse me. Let's bring that up. First, quick message from City Heating and Air, hot or cold, brought to you by City Heating and Air Conditioning, cityheatandair.com.
Hi, Mike Davis here with City Heating and Air, reminding you to always dare to compare. Our team provides quality local heating and air service, installation, and maintenance across East Tennessee. We use only the best equipment like American Standard heating and air conditioning for your residential, new construction, or commercial needs. Honesty, dependability, and customer satisfaction have been the cornerstones of our business since 1961. City Heat and Air.
Dare to compare.
Welcome back to Off the Hook Sports, comparing Jeremy Pruitt hires on their face to other hires Tennessee made. Lane Kiffin. Okay, guys, I'm sorry, but the Jeremy Pruitt hire was better than the Lane Kiffin hire on its face. It was. That's a hot take of mine. Lane Kiffin's a better coach, but this is based on their credentials at the time of when they were hired by Tennessee. Lane Kiffin's credentials were being USC's offensive coordinator. That carried as much weight as being Alabama's defensive coordinator with all the talent at the time, given when Lane Kiffin was USC's offensive coordinator. His other credential was getting fired publicly by the Raiders and Al Davis and being in a public spat with him and being called a liar. He had no real credentials. That was a splash attempt by Mike Hamilton and a move to try to overpay the staff to try to sell something at Tennessee in a big splash way. It was a failure. And it could have worked out, but the hire, even on its face, was not as good as the Jeremy Pruitt hire, believe it or not. Derek Dooley. Yeah, the hire on its face was worse than Jeremy Pruitt's. Even though Derek Dooley had been a head coach, he had a losing record in 3 years at Louisiana Tech as a head coach, only 1 winning season, and had never been a coordinator before then and had never had any success. So Derek Dooley was a worse hire on its face. Butch Jones. Okay. On its face, Butch Jones was a better hire than Jeremy Pruitt. Now, he didn't work out, and he's the most annoying coach I've ever covered. I have a disdain for him that I don't have for any of the other coaches. But in 6 years, he had won 4 championships before that. And I know people saying he inherited 2 programs from Brian Kelly, but they're smaller levels. You have to maintain that success. And he did. And he only had 1 losing season in 6 years. And he had he only had 2 years where he didn't win the conference title and only 1 year where he had a losing season. And by the way, he almost had 5 conference titles. He lost the 5th one on a final drive in his second year at Central Michigan. Butch Jones, on its face, was a very, very, very good hire coming from Cincinnati to Tennessee. Not a very, very good hire, but a better hire than Jeremy Pruitt. What about Jeremy Pruitt himself? On its face, better hires of the candidates during that time. Greg Schiano. No, I still was fine with nixing the Greg Schiano hire. There was too much baggage with Greg Schiano. He was toxic as an NFL coach, had a level of arrogance about him that never would have fitted in college at Tennessee again. Even though he'd had experience as a head coach at Rutgers. I get that. I think he had really fallen off towards the end. It wouldn't have worked. On his face, though, Jeff Brom, better hire than Jeremy Pruitt. Mike Leach, better hire than Jeremy Pruitt. Mike Gundy, better hire than Jeremy Pruitt. Dave Doran, no, not a better hire. Dave Doran had a ceiling. You didn't know if Jeremy Pruitt had a ceiling at the time. And finally, Josh Heupel or Jeremy Pruitt, better hire. On its face, Josh Heupel, but not by much, because remember, Josh Heupel's track record was just repeating what Scott Frost did by going undefeated his first year and then getting slightly worse each year at UCF. So we didn't know how he'd work out. So truth be told, it was a little tougher than you might think over who was better on its face.